a story of traditions of Black philanthropy and growing up in my hometown, and also in some of my travels I observed ways of generosity and how people give and support to one another and rally for causes. And in working in the field of philanthropy, once I left my international work and relocated to Charlotte, back to my home state, and worked in the philanthropic realm, I saw lots of stories on headlines and in society pages and nonprofit newsletters, and lots of imagery and messages. And oftentimes those did not align with my experiences and things that I valued and things I'd seen in my lifetime, and saw an opportunity to lift up those stories because I know they weren't mine alone, but others had observed and experienced and benefited from some of the same beliefs around giving and philanthropy.
Valaida Fullwood is a writer and project strategist who realizes ideas and dreams. She is the author of Giving Back, a tribute to generations of African American philanthropists, named one of the 10 best Black books of 2011, and winner of the prestigious Terry McAdam Book Award as 2012's most inspirational and useful new book for the nonprofit sector. She is also the vision keeper and principal architect for Giving Back, the soul of philanthropy reframed and exhibited, a museum exhibition that has toured the nation and will soon be featured at a national conference hosted by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Valaida is also a poet and public speaker who's inspired audiences throughout the nation. Welcome, Valaida. It's great to have you here.
Hi, Mark.
Here are some words that you have used to describe yourself: writer, thinker, listener, speaker, idea whisperer, traveler, mad word geek, absolute Scrabble freak, drinker of life, damn good friend, ridiculous foodie, imaginative dreamer, Southerner with hillbilly roots, and far-stretched global sights. What a statement about yourself.
Yeah, I kind of stretched myself to tap into who I see myself as, all the different facets of myself, and that was a stretch in terms of for me to reveal that or to present myself in that way.
Well, you managed to wear many hats at once: writer, public speaker, project manager, consultant. How do you make it all work?
I suppose that could be debatable, but I thrive from the creativity and the challenge that it poses for myself in managing my time and orienting myself for the skill sets that each hat requires. So some more introspective, some more extroverted, like creating a blog and writing about things. And some it's just my experience, like growing up in the South, but always having a excitement and interest about the world.
Well, with all those hats that you wear, how do you describe what you do?
I generally keep it brief and say I'm a writer and I manage special projects in the philanthropic realm.
Idea whisperer. What a wonderful phrase. How are you an idea whisperer?
Well, it's a riff on horse whisperer. So I see ideas as being wild and untamed and sometimes abundant, at least in my head, but not always in other people's heads. So I have a way of dreaming up lots of ideas and then finding ways to tame them into workable, constructive projects and products and experiences.
Is there an idea you have whispered that remains memorable to you?
Well, the most prominent one, I suppose, was the idea for the book Giving Back. That experience was very seminal in that it was so clear and it happened one night and I had a burst of creativity and wrote down the full concept for the book and even some of the possibilities around the book, not specifically an exhibit, so to speak, but knowing that it could spark or be a springboard for lots of other work. So that particular idea that came to me and that I nurtured and tend to and tamed and harnessed and have been riding for the last few years.
Well, your website includes a quote by Frank Lloyd Wright that says, "An idea is salvation by imagination." Why did you choose that quote?
Because whenever I've been at a crossroads or questions about the future, it's usually an idea that emerges, or an idea emerges that clears the path for me, sets the way. And I mean, early on, it was ideas about travel and seeing the world, and all those things manifested. It directed my studies in school, my initial career, my interests today, and a lot of the skill set I have today. And specifically, the Giving Back project and that idea has created a purpose and, saved me in many respects.
So as a consultant and as a collaborator, as someone who helps other people realize their dreams and ideas, do you see yourself as someone who, in some ways, with the work that you do, offers salvation?
Suppose so. When I think about my work and what drives me, I suppose you could sum it up that way, in that in sharing stories, hopefully in compelling ways, saves people from misguided notions about life or other people's experiences or about themselves. So yes, I suppose so.
Is there an element of being a spiritual instrument in your work?
Not consciously, but in being reflective, I feel that the path I'm on now, related to the book and the exhibit and talking about facets of philanthropy, which, when distilled down, comes down to love, that certainly is a spiritual path, and in many ways, I guess, a calling for me. I feel driven and compelled, and opportunities have opened up that thrust me forward when I'd really prefer to sit back or go entirely different direction. That life and experiences just nudge me forward down this path.
That's a wonderful phrase, that philanthropy is love. How is philanthropy love?
Well, in its truest sense, etymological sense, Greek word or phrase meaning love of what it means to be human, or love of humanity. I choose to break it all down and make it as inclusive as possible to mean love of what it means to be human, and to, with all of our strengths and foibles and flaws, weaknesses, and heights and gifts. So philanthropy is recognizing that in others as well as in yourself, and giving and supporting other human beings.
We'll talk about your work and your mission as someone who supports philanthropy. But who you are today began in Morganton, North Carolina.
Yes.
What is memorable or notable about Morganton?
Well, for people who aren't familiar, it's in western North Carolina at the foot of the mountains. And it's a beautiful green community, a small, I guess a large town might be how it's described. And just visually, with the mountains as a backdrop and lots of green spaces and water features, waterfalls and streams and rivers. The Catawba River flows through it. All those things, visuals, feed me, and I probably fed my sense of the visual, which plays into much of my work today. And then the relationships of the people there. My family is from Morganton, going back, or Burke County, for about 8 generations, so I have very deep roots there, and always felt a reason for being in a place there, a home. So that helped shape me. But also, I suspect I don't know the origins of my interest, the global sites reference that I mentioned earlier. I don't know if being from a small town helped feed that, and watching TV and seeing places all around the globe and people speaking different languages that I didn't have that experience on a regular basis at home, that made me interested in the world. But as early as I can remember, that is the most striking thing, like 3 years old. And one of the stories I remember is having heard adults talk about digging a hole to China. And I had a complete love for everything Asian, and perhaps because that represents an entirely different culture and literally around the world. So when I heard the phrase dig a hole to China, when I would see construction sites and the men excavating and really deep holes, I would look out and think, wow, if I just jumped in, I would be in China. So I was fascinated in all kind of ways, and that's one example.
Morganton's about 15 to 20,000 people, I understand.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I think the county's a little bigger, but yes.
So many of the people you knew were people that you saw on a frequent basis in a very small town.
Yes, network, everybody, for the most part, knew me, knew my parents, were related to me, or went to school with my parents. My closest friends today were all formed, and the friendships and relationships were formed by, I'd say, 12 years old. One of my best friends, we had the same babysitter at 2-3 years old, and we ended up going to college together. We're still very, very close friends. Another dear friend we met in kindergarten, and my other friends I met in junior high school or high school, and pretty much all of them remain my friends. A lot of us majority of them, we went to college together.
Tell me about your family, Valaida.
Well, again, I mentioned we have deep roots in Burke County, which is my dad's hometown. I have my mom and my sister and my dad, only one sibling, and my sister and I are pretty close. We're about 19 months apart, so we've been around each other our entire lives, and we're just very family-oriented, very loving, very supportive, and I remain close to them now. My parents are often here in Charlotte, and my sister and I go back home pretty frequently.
What did you value growing up?
I have to bring it back to family. Family was just really important. Just our close connections, the holidays together, Sunday dinners together. And I had a set of cousins about my age, so we all grew up together. It was like having a bigger family of siblings. And Sundays going up to the parkway and picnicking and playing kickball. It was just very, idyllic in many ways compared to others' stories especially. And church and faith were key elements, and also education. My mom's a teacher, was a high school teacher, and my dad served on the school board in my hometown. And in fact, he was chair of the school board for a period. So education was key and valued, along with faith and family.
Mm-hmm. How did others describe Valaida Fullwood when you were young?
Reserved. I was often the kid inside who'd prefer to read or play alone, draw, and rather introverted, while my sister, who's more extroverted, was outside playing and involved in sports. So also artistic. Early on I had an interest in drawing and painting and took art classes from my earliest years. So yes, reserved and artistic and smart.
So the world of imagination was part of your life at a young age?
Absolutely, yes.
So you graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with a degree in international affairs and a concentration in economics. Why international affairs and why economics?
Well, I think I've explained some of my interest in global topics and issues, and that was really cemented between my junior and senior year of high school. I was an exchange student to Latin America. My placement was with a family in La Paz, Bolivia, and that was unequivocally a defining moment and experience. Having come from a small town, as I've described, and my family, as I've described, and going to La Paz, a capital city and major city, a place where I hadn't chosen to go. In fact, I'd expected or hoped to go to Europe. I'd been studying French for several years and expected to go to France or some other European country that had a French-speaking population, maybe Switzerland or something, and ended up in La Paz. At the time, in which still may be true, Bolivia was the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere after Haiti. So issues of poverty were stark, and class distinctions. I also was placed in a Bolivian family where the mother was a single mother. She was divorced and she had 4 children. So I came into a family unlike my own. So I learned some of the dynamics and pressures of being in a family with a single mother, and then also having lots of siblings, and not just a single mother, but a divorced mother. So there were some tensions there between my Bolivian father and mother. And I was placed at a German school. There's a large German population in Bolivia. And so I didn't speak Spanish, but I ended up at a German school. So I had all kinds of rich experiences that shaped my point of view and directed me. So when I went to Chapel Hill, I hadn't thought about a career in the international field. I knew I wanted to travel, but I didn't think it would be my profession. And one day on a bus during my sophomore year, I think it was the last semester of my sophomore year, I overheard some guys on a bus talking about their majors, and one said his was international affairs, and I thought, they have that here? That sounds like me. So I chose it, and I could have chosen other concentrations, but economics sounded marketable. It wasn't an interest. I didn't have any natural proficiencies there, but it sounded solid, made sense, and would satisfy my parents who were paying for my college.
Did you travel during those years at Chapel Hill?
No, I did not. I was in Chapel Hill that entire time.
You soon traveled afterwards.
Yes.
For nearly a decade, you worked for major corporations, living and working overseas, managing international development projects. Tell me about those years.
Yes, in fact, I've been reflective this year because my godson just graduated from college, which made me think about my college graduation. And one of the things I recall is that final semester. My college years were not glorious years for me. It was a struggle academically and socially, trying to find myself in Chapel Hill. And so my final semester, while everybody was interviewing with all the Fortune 500 companies that were on campus, and I was a little stressed because my GPA and my collegiate years weren't impressive, and so I was nervous about scheduling these interviews. And at some point I decided I'm going to let that go. I'm going to focus on this semester and getting out of here in 4 years, and I'll worry about jobs later. So I did, and as it turns out, the day after graduation, I got a call out of the blue from my mother's college roommate who I'd met 2 years prior. Her name is Valaida Randolph, and she had just taken over a division of GE, an international division of GE, and said, "Hey, Valaida, I recall your saying 2 years ago when we first met that you were studying international affairs. Well, I just got named director of this new division. Why don't you come up for an interview?" And then the next day, a cousin called and said, "Valaida, when I was in North Carolina for Easter, you said you were majoring in international affairs. Well, I work for Sister Cities International in Washington, D.C., and we hire interns or bring on board interns every year. Why don't you come up for an interview? So literally a week after graduating, by the skin of my teeth, I got on a flight and flew to New Jersey to interview at GE and to a train to D.C. to interview for the internship. And ultimately landed both, got the internship, worked there for 6 months, and interviewed in D.C., and then went on to work for GE, and landed the job of my dreams, meaning working for an international company, flying all around the world at someone else's expenses, going to Asia on a regular basis, and eating all kinds of amazing new foods and meeting people from all over the globe. And a job I didn't even know existed, my dream job, that I didn't even know existed.
Where are some of the places that you went?
Indonesia, I worked on a project there, so I traveled and worked in Jakarta a lot. And with each of those trips, I'd take time out and hang out in Bali, which was pretty amazing. Belize, Jamaica, trying to think some other places, but those are some of the primary places I went on a regular basis. And then, of course, acquiring all those frequent flyer points, would take time out and go to Thailand and Japan and Hong Kong and pretty much anywhere I could eke out a trip. Along with the business trip, I'd do it.
So here you are with a major corporation with the job of your dreams, flying around the world. It's not what you do today.
Right.
So a transition occurred.
Yes. I would say during those years, an epiphany occurred at a stage, and I remember this very distinctly, that I recognized the gift that I had of having this amazing dream job, and not only all the perks I just mentioned, but also at a point I left GE and started working for a British company. So my boss was in London. So I was top dog at our U.S. office, with the corner office literally, and traveling around the States and internationally with a boss overseas. So I had a lot of autonomy without all the responsibility of truly being in charge, and my boss across the pond. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty sweet. And it would probably be unrealistic to think it's going to get better than this in every way. Something's got to give. Either I'm going to have a boss hovering over me, or I'm not going to be able to travel, something. You know, I'm going to have to create what comes next. So while I don't fancy myself as having an entrepreneurial spirit in conventional sense, at some point I recognize that this is probably as far as I can go, as sweet as it can be, with being somebody else kind of creating that space. I'm going to have to design and create what comes next to outdo this. And an opportunity came to do that.
Was there something essential that you learned about yourself during those years?
I guess my curiosity. I mean, I'm being open and curious. It really helped in all those international travels, and being able to get all I could from those experiences. And probably growing up in the safety and love of a small town helped with me being fearless, I suppose. I didn't know what I could be afraid of, traveling alone to really remote places and undeveloped places economically. And so I just jumped at every opportunity, sometimes kind of blindly, but had really rich experiences as a result.
So you really gained some confidence and learned to trust yourself.
Absolutely. Going places where they don't speak the language.
Yeah. So there is another quote on your website by Zora Neale Hurston. And she said, "There is no agony like bearing an untold story inside you." And there came a time when you began to bear an untold story that became an idea that you whispered to yourself. What was that story? What was that idea?
That was a story of traditions of black philanthropy. And growing up in my hometown, and also in some of my travels, I observed ways of generosity, how people give and support to one another and rally for causes. And in working in the field of philanthropy, once I left my international work and relocated to Charlotte, back to my home state, and worked in the philanthropic realm, I saw lots of stories on headlines and in society pages and nonprofit newsletters, and lots of imagery and messages. And oftentimes those did not align with my experiences and things that I valued and things I'd seen in my lifetime, and saw an opportunity to lift up those stories because I know they weren't mine alone, but others had observed and experienced and benefited from some of the same beliefs around giving and philanthropy.
So let's break that down. What
Yep.
were those messages that were not aligning with your reality?
I guess to break it down would be that if not for the generosity and benevolence of wealthy white men, the world would be at peril. That kind of sums it up. And I'm thinking, wow, there's more to the story than that. Granted, the stories of Ford and Carnegie and Rockefeller and titans of industry who turned their sometimes ill-begotten wealth and riches into philanthropic and benevolent deeds and foundations, that there was more to the story of philanthropy. It didn't rest just there.
And the story that was untold was what?
The stories that were untold, I guess the prime one is the one that drove me. It was a story of my great aunt Dora, who I had observed all of my life. She'd just been a quiet kind of giver as a mother and grandmother. She was a den mother, a foster mother, and a spiritual mother as a pastor of a church. And in her retirement, or as she approached retirement, she founded a soup kitchen. She began feeding people in a public housing community. And that just struck me, like, why would she do that? I mean, her entire life she's been giving and doing and been a good person. Isn't it time to kind of chill and be selfish? And it was through her life and experience that I recognize another story of philanthropy and another way that people give back and have impact. And my Aunt Dora, at 96, is still with us today, vibrant, still very generous and engaging and hilarious and driving. So, I think her generosity influenced her longevity.
So you've talked about how this idea of telling this untold story landed upon you. What was happening in your life before we actually get into the idea and the execution of the idea?
Well, yes. I was working as a consultant in the philanthropic realm, engaged in a lot of community activities. I had just been part of forming a new giving circle, new generation of African American philanthropists. And I was searching. I remember saying to friends, I feel like I've just had so many wonderful experiences and learned so much and gained some knowledge on a variety of topics and have a great network of people I know in Charlotte. And I thought, well, I feel like I should do something more or bigger given, where I'm presently sitting and some of the access that I have. And I guess in being open to that possibility, the idea for the book emerged. I wasn't seeking to write a book or to be an author. It was never an aspiration, but a confluence of events and circumstances.
Do you have a memory of how that idea manifested?
Yes. Very distinct memory, very precise memory. I can say it was April 27th or 28th, 2007, at a conference of the Women's Funding Network in Seattle. And so I'd flown out there. A group had underwritten my participation at that conference because I had formed a giving circle. So they thought, I'm a woman who's helping to form a giving circle along with some other women. I might benefit from attending this conference. So I flew out. I don't know if it was the jet lag and lack of oxygen from the long flight out. But one evening, I had that idea, and it was seated this way. I hadn't attended this conference session, but I overheard another woman who was part of our delegation say she'd attended a session where she heard about a women's giving circle in Tennessee that over 10 years had raised $1 million through a luncheon that they had every year and a program book they'd create. So men would send in stories about their wives, daughters, mothers, and sisters about their philanthropy and would pay to have a story and an image in the program booklet. And every year they raised about $100,000 from the creation of that program book and the luncheon where they released it. And over those 10 years, it generated $1 million. And I thought, wow, that is amazing. Could we do that? My circle's about a year old. Could we do something like that? And the more I reflected on it, I thought, no, probably not. And not because the Black community isn't philanthropic. It's because of this disconnect between institutional philanthropy, or what's considered mainstream philanthropy, and the traditions of giving in Black communities. And while it's all part of the philanthropic spectrum, the broader community doesn't always recognize it as philanthropy, and the Black community doesn't always recognize how we do as philanthropy. And maybe a book would help bridge that connection. I'd read academic papers and foundations, white papers about Black philanthropy, and I thought, well, but the broader community needs to know this. The average person needs to know this. What about a book that's really artful and appealing to the average person outside the field that brings imagery and vignette stories together to make that connection between giving back, and philanthropy, that it's all part of the same thing. And I had that idea that day, and that night went to the whole room and was up all night writing this out, the possibilities and the vision for what the cover would look like and how the imagery would be. That would be black and white, that it would be not the traditional kind of portraits that you see on boardroom walls or the society page headline pictures of the big check or somebody writing a check, but it would be more soulful, poignant, and showing the soul of philanthropy. And
you had a particular clarity as to what that image might be on the cover of the book, didn't you?
I did. I thought it would be the weathered, leathered hands of a black person, an elderly black person, one of our elders in the community. I didn't know if it would be a man or a woman, but I just had clarity around what that would look like, and that the hands would be specifically positioned in a way that it didn't look like a hand out, like oftentimes you see imagery, particularly of people of African descent, hands out for water or food or something in need, but poised in a way that didn't speak to either being a giver or receiver, just neutral in respect. And that was just an idea I had in my head. And then lo and behold, when we had our first photo shoot, I don't know if it was by intention, but I knew hands would be a primary image throughout the book. And on that first day, Charles Thomas, the photographer I collaborated with on the project, took some photographs. And oftentimes it was of people's hands. And remarkably, it was the hands of my 90-some-year-old great aunt that proved to be the perfect image for the cover of the book.
So you're struck by this amazing idea. You're suddenly filled with mission and passion. And now you have to execute.
Yeah.
You're pregnant now with this idea, are you not?
Yeah.
So what was that process of creation?
Horrific. Yeah, the ideas are awesome. It's the execution that's the bitch. But wow. I lots of things on paper. Good thing is I did have a plan. The not so good thing is that plan bore little resemblance to what it actually took. I think it was 2007 I mentioned when I had the idea. was all around by the time 2008. The idea was pretty solid. I'd pitched it to a couple of folks, had some prospective sponsors, had gotten into the weeds on all the details it would take and the money we'd need to raise and how we'd engage people. And we were just about to roll that out when, lo and behold, the economy crashed. And at that point, in 2008, the last thing anybody wanted to talk about was just celebrate philanthropy in a general sense. It was in crisis mode, so everything was oriented toward making sure people had food and shelter and just basic needs being met. And so it definitely required some rerouting of the plan. It was also at a time when Barack Obama was ascending to the presidency, so much of the black community especially was focused on his campaign. People were out raising money, giving money, hosting events. Everything was about supporting his becoming president. So there was no room to talk about my project, about black philanthropy and celebrating traditions of giving, even though we were witnessing it with a lot of the small dollar donors that helped support his candidacy or make his candidacy successful. We were witnessing it. It wasn't something anybody was looking to write about or study or contribute to at that time. So I had to kindle the idea and the flame around it, and while I waited till a different time, and had to rethink how we approached it, how we raised funds, how we rolled it out. And that was a creative process in and of itself to kind of maintain the vision and integrity, but find a new path to bring it about.
When you were seeking support for the book, underwriting dollars to pay for all that was required to produce the book, how did you present the idea of the book quickly or efficiently so that way others could understand what it would be?
It was a challenge. Because it was a new idea, at least how I wanted to roll it out, I found it was difficult for people really to get their hands around what was in my head, what was so clear in my head. And so I learned to be okay with that nobody was going to be as enthusiastic or see the possibilities as clearly as I did. So I would, depending on who the audience is, try to tap into what their interest around it could be, paint the full picture, and again, be okay if they didn't quite grasp it, but make sure they grasp key concepts enough to buy in and offer support. So I was fortunate, or we were fortunate to have the support, some early supporters from our philanthropic community here in Charlotte, institutional philanthropy here in Charlotte, and that provided the seed funds. And then later, rolling it out to the general public, people who would actually might be featured or actually in the book, that took a little longer. Part of the idea was to bridge this gap between traditional black giving and what's known as philanthropy. And that gap was so entrenched, it was often hard to get people to share their stories because they're like, that's not me. I'm not a philanthropist. I don't know any philanthropists. So it took time to kind of break down the meeting, boil it down to distill it to the love factor, and paint pictures of the kinds of giving that people in the black community were traditionally comfortable with or recognized, and then people had their aha moments and could see value in it and value in sharing their stories. So
the basic idea was to profile a number of folks from different walks of life from the black community and how they give and share their time, talent, and treasure to support each other and others in the community. And in telling that story, you reframe what philanthropy is.
Precisely.
You've spoken about how the project tested you, that there were moments of existential crisis. Tell me about those moments.
Well, those were some of those days when you realize nobody else sees how awesome this could be when, the voices of the naysayers, not only questioning or not only people who didn't get it, but people who, whatever it is they got, didn't buy into the vision of it. And so to anchor myself in my beliefs and the possibilities and confidence in myself, despite others' questions or questioning or doubts or unhelpful suggestions, shortcuts to completing the book. I've had to dig deep and revisit why I was doing this. And so it helped to have had it all written down early on that I could refer to as a compass. And I believe, for me, God was a force in whenever some of those weakest moments, something would happen to just spur me forward. Whether it was a birthday party for my great aunt Dora, who had been the core inspiration for it, and she'd have another birthday, and I would just know that her story has to be shared. Hers and other stories have to be shared. Or other celebrations and events that would say, Valaida, you have to do this. And then at a point, I couldn't go back. I had so many stories or people counting on me, and, wasn't even so much about the sponsors and donors. It was more about the people who had entrusted me to tell these stories, very poignant stories.
What does the word reframing mean to you?
Mm-hmm. Well, I often paint the picture, kind of like with photography. You can zoom in on a facet of something, zoom in on something very specific, or you could go at it with a wider angle. And so I feel like mainstream philanthropy has been framed very narrow, only on high net worth individuals and Eurocentric values and traditions of philanthropy. And in some ways, that fact has kind of hijacked the original meaning of the word and the possibilities of the word for something very specific that suits fundraisers to frame it like that, but doesn't benefit society or humanity ultimately. And that by acknowledging philanthropy is more than zeros behind a dollar sign, and tapping into the true core, that humanity, the human element, a much richer and broader picture emerges. And so giving back was a way of widening that lens and stretching people's minds to see philanthropy as more than only Rockefeller or Bill Gates or Oprah, that possibilities existed for all of us to be philanthropists, and that there are other traditions of giving born out of the African experience and values that have as much value and possibilities and strength and power as the other, if we look at it that way.
The project didn't simply remain a book. Giving Back has transformed into a multimedia exhibition that has toured and traveled throughout the country. How did that transformation occur?
Well, I will say, some folks ask, are you surprised by all these elements? And I try to be humble, but also say, no, I'm not surprised. Early on, that early vision, and then in collaboration with Charles, he had a big vision as well. And we always saw the possibilities. We recognized how the stories and lifting this up and the way we presented it would resonate with people and shift people's thinking, and it could be a powerful vehicle. So over time, we acted on that belief, and it's come to be. So yes, after the book, we did our share of book talks, and still do, and book signings, and then looked at ways to use the book as a tool for more in-depth workshops and community conversations on it. and ways that people could lift up and share their own stories. And before the book was even published, both Charles and I had thoughts about an exhibition. Charles at the time worked at the Light Factory, which is a museum of photography. And so, yes, of course, he was thinking an exhibition. And we kept pressing that. Early on, we pressed, but couldn't get any biters. Nobody was interested. And the book itself and promoting it took on a life of its own. So it was kind of like, let's let that exhibit thing rest. But we had some opportunities about 2 or 3 years later, specifically the Association of African American Museums. Its national conference was here in Charlotte. And out of the blue, we got a request to be part of a panel or to organize a panel discussion for a pre-conference session. So Charles and I went to that. And it was there that we, in an audience of about 100 museum professionals, we mentioned plans to launch an exhibition, and which was aspirational, actually, and kind of ambitious given where we stood at the time. But immediately afterward, we got feedback that some folks were interested in it. Some museums were interested, some funders were interested, and we should pursue it. And so we did, and we ended up partnering with folks at Johnson C. Smith University here in Charlotte and put in a grant proposal to the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the major federal funder of museums and libraries and colleges, and received funding to reimagine the book Giving Back as a touring museum exhibition. And it was pretty remarkable and, helped set a whole new path. And IMLS, the funder, they said, well, of course we're interested in a exhibit, but more so in the programming. So it was lots of focus and thought on how to create an exhibit that facilitated conversation and discussion and interactivity and engagement with audiences. So that's one of the things I'm most proud of. Having an exhibit is nice of the work and some of the excerpts of the narratives, but creating something where in and of itself is an experience and a learning for people and offer some interactivity, but then also create space for further, deeper discussions about all facets of philanthropy, whether it's intergenerational philanthropy, whether it's preparing the next generation of philanthropists, whether it's about Black philanthropy specifically and traditions of giving in our communities, or about other cultural traditions of giving.
It's been 10 years since you were struck by that idea, and you've published a book, you've presented throughout the nation, you've inspired so many people to rethink and reframe what philanthropy is. There is a quote of yours: "I have a habit of letting my imagination run away from me. It always comes back, though, drenched with possibilities." Where is your imagination taking you next?
Let's see, my imagination, that pesky imagination. It's taking me to a new project that's still under development and can draw on and build on some of the lessons of the last 10 years from my Giving Back experience. And I'm still nurturing it at the moment, so I won't reveal it at this point, but I'm hopeful and prayerful that I have a confluence of resources and opportunity and time to bring it to fruition. Stay tuned.
As you think about your life, is there an idea or a cause or a mission or a hope that guides you?
I'm not conscious of it if there is, but I think, I guess I do have a consciousness or lately a recognition around leaving a legacy. And earlier you made reference to, being pregnant with an idea. So I don't have earthly children, but with my ideas and my projects and their progeny, it will be part of my legacy.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Mark.
Fullwood is a writer and project strategist. She is the author of Giving Back, a tribute to generations of African American philanthropists, and principal architect of Giving Back, The Soul of Philanthropy Reframed and Exhibited, a touring museum exhibit that will be featured at a national conference hosted by the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History. And now a personal word. The story that Valaida tells of an idea that landed upon her that was fully formed summons another idea about ideas. Is there a place outside ourselves where ideas reside independent of our material bodies? Some non-physical place where ideas exist perfectly and then embed themselves imperfectly in the physical world we inhabit? This is an old idea, of course. It is the idea of the theory of forms that Plato speaks of through his characters in his dialogues. Plato is troubled by two problems that, in thinking about life and meaning, we consider on this podcast. How can humans live happy and fulfilling lives in a contingent, changing world where everything we attach ourselves to eventually slips away? How can the world appear both permanent and impermanent? The world we perceive through our senses is always changing, but the ideas and concepts we contemplate seem eternal. Which is real, and why does it appear both ways? Plato resolves these questions by splitting up existence into two realms, the material realm and the transcendent realm of forms. Forms are abstract, pure and perfect and outside of time and space. The two realms are connected. All objects in the world are copies of forms. Forms inform the lives we lead. Humans have access to the realm of forms through our mind, through reason or rational thinking. Contemplation of the realm of forms, a realm Plato called the good, or what we might call the Platonic ideal, allows us to consider what is good and to bring goodness into the world. Valaida speaks of idea whispering, of summoning forms into material existence, or having the idea land upon her. With her book and exhibit and programming, she is realizing the idea she had for reframing philanthropy in this world. All creators are idea whisperers, accessing and conjuring and shaping ideas and working to realize them in the material world. Ideating to realizing is creating. The work to realize this podcast is the same. We have an idea for what it might be ideally realized as we seek to bring more goodness into the world. I'm Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Thank you to my amazing partners, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, art and media director. We are supported by friends and listeners to this podcast. Please visit us at onlifeandmeaning.com and become a patron of the show. Thank you for listening.